Ivan.
Ivan.
Yeah, Ivan. Ivan. They call me Ivan at work, In political business, I'm Ivan. That's the rule.
Welcome to the Belarus Factor, the podcast where politics, power, and real talk about Belarus collide. I'm Ivan Kravtsov, broadcasting from exile and bringing you the truth behind the headlines.
Hey, welcome everyone to the second episode of Belarus Factor, the podcast by me, Ivan Kravtsov. Happy to be here with you. And today we have an excellent guest. I'm proud to present Valery Kavaleuski, a former Belarusian diplomat who served 8 years in the MFA. He also worked in embassy in District Columbia. He graduated from Georgetown University, worked at World Bank, and was part of the team of Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya for 3 years after 2020. Valery is a seasoned diplomat, and he knows the context of North American politics very well and world politics in general. When he worked in the office of Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, he created the foreign affairs businesses that the democratic opposition of Belarus conducted. Now he founded his own think tank, Euro-Atlantic Affairs Agency, which works on policy development for different political actors and consults various foreign organizations which have interest in Belarus and the affairs around it. Valery, happy to have you today.
Hi, Ivan. Thanks for having me here today, and it's a pleasure to be your first guest.
I've started this podcast targeting English-speaking audiences so they can know more about Belarus and bring perspectives in the region from the point of view of Belarusian politics. But nevertheless, I think we can spend a bit on the North American political agenda. The President Trump has been inaugurated recently, and he barraged with 100 executive orders this week, starting from Monday. There is a great impact from these orders. The consequences are yet to be understood, I guess, because some of these orders are not fully, I think, understood. But yet Marco Rubio, who was confirmed by the Senate recently as a Secretary of State, chairing the Department of State of the United States, also followed with a very interesting executive action, which freezes all foreign aid to all countries except Egypt, I think, and Israel. There are two exceptions to this executive order. And this executive order freezes all foreign aid, and as I understand, also to the democratic forces of Belarus and civil society of Belarus, because some of the folks from the community has been reaching me out throughout this week and even today that, some U.S. implementing partners has reached out to them and said that all the disbursements will be frozen for now. So what do you know about it, and what do you think about the Trump administration, and what consequences and impact it will have on the Belarusian democratic movement and as a situation at whole?
This is quite a dramatic development, and this is very fresh news, especially when it comes to the decision of Secretary Rubio to freeze all the disbursements. Even though we remember that this conversation, this discussion about foreign aid by former future President Trump during campaign was quite present in the public narrative, so it had to be expected. And once he has become elected, of course, he's becoming delivering on his promises. And now his executive orders count in hundreds. So it seems that he is literally kind of storming into the political and financial economic space, not only of the United States, but the entire world. And so these shock waves of his decision-making, they go far. And Belarus is not an exception. For Belarus, it is especially important, an especially important development, given that democratic forces, democratic movement in general, civil society, political structures, independent media, who had to relocate from Belarus after 2020, they have become really dependent on this aid. This is a lifeline for them. U.S. aid is being also matched by the aid from the European Union, which makes it possible to sustain the movement. I would say that the resources that have been allocated by our democratic partners have been significant, but they have not been sufficient. They have been good to sustain the movement, to continue operations, but they have never been actually sufficient to prevail when it comes to changing the situation in Belarus, to bringing democracy in Belarus. When we analyze the consequences of shutting down aid from the United States, even for 90 days, we understand that many initiatives will experience a lot of pain.
Yeah. What numbers are we really talking here about? So I remember there is something like 30 millions per year
Yes.
of U.S. foreign assistance to the democratic community. So it's been 4 years since 2020 political crisis after fraud elections. So we're talking here about around 120 million, something
That's
like
right.
that. Yeah?
That's right. And similar numbers come from the European Union, about 30 million euro per year.
But you say this is really not enough. So, but I mean, but it sounds like quite a lot for me. It's a big number. Why do you think it doesn't really meet the demands of the civic society in Belarus?
When we even compare the costs of for independent media, they're very important to deliver information, objective, quality information to Belarusians inside Belarus. We can compare the sums that are allocated by Russian and Belarusian propaganda. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars only on propaganda and disinformation. To counter this disinformation, you need to have not the same resources, but commensurate resources, and the amount of funds that has been spent on independent media of Belarus, it's been fairly modest. We're talking about probably like 15-20 million per year. So this is not enough to fight back. This is not enough to counter disinformation propaganda from Russian or Belarusian regimes.
Mm-hmm.
And this is only one sector. And we're also talking about human rights defenders. We're also talking civil society. We're also talking about hundreds and already thousands of political prisoners who have been released. And they need support. They need rehabilitation. Or those who stay in prisons, their families also need a lot of support in order to mitigate some of the negative effects of their imprisonment.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point. So as I understand, some of it, parts of this aid actually goes for direct support to the families of the prisoners, of the political prisoners, and the political prisoners that have been released and left the country, right? So they receive this support also from this budget. But nevertheless, the finance is only one aspect of foreign policy, soft power. But what about more conventional means like diplomacy? Or even, hard power. So what changes do you expect will be brought by Marco Rubio in the State Department in terms of U.S. support for the Belarusian opposition exile, or in general? Do you expect any change of stance towards Belarus and the political situation in Belarus?
Yeah, I would, first of all, we started counting these 90 days to assess the efficiency of aid of the United States for the entire world. Belarus is no exception. So we'll have to see and wait what would be the results, what would be the outcomes, what would be the findings and the decisions after these 90 days. Of course, we're hopeful that, I'm hopeful that the amount of aid from the United States will remain on the same level. But also, when it comes to political decision-making, it comes to general policy of the United States on Belarus, I anticipate that there will be continuity from administration to administration. And this is because for decades, since 90s, when Lukashenko came to power, there has been a very solid, very steady consensus inside DC. Or between Democrats and between Republicans. So there's a very stable constituency when it comes to democratic Belarus. Politicians from both sides of the aisle are quite quite united in their view of the need for democratic, sovereign, independent Belarus, especially now when Belarus is under a lot of stress because of actions of Russia, because Lukashenko has allowed Russia essentially to instrumentalize the entire country in its confrontation with the Western world. And all those politicians, experts, diplomats, they are where they used to be, even during Biden administration. So there is no reason for them to change their stance on Belarus. Of course, Belarus is not a number one priority on the US foreign policy list of priorities. And actually, this also allows for more sort of depoliticized approach when it comes to interactions between democratic forces and political establishment in Washington, D.C.
By depoliticized, do you mean...
I mean that it does not have to become the agenda of the president of the United States.
Sure. So,
yeah.
so you mean like the staff is working like day to day on a day-to-day
Correct.
basis
Yes.
with Belarus, and if the Secretary of State of the President doesn't mention Belarus, doesn't mean that the U.S. government doesn't follow the
Exactly
events
the
closely,
case.
right?
Exactly the
Okay.
case. Yeah.
Okay. So you don't expect any easing on Lukashenko or even a relief of sanctions, because there have been a lot of speculations about, Trump lifting off the sanctions from Russia, etc., the war in Ukraine, there's supposed to be negotiations about ceasefire. So you think this is not really the case yet, right?
You're exactly right at pointing at a variable that could be changing, the game changer for the entire region, not only for Belarus. Yes, peace process might be complicated. It might be painful also for some of the countries that have been involved in this. And unfortunately, Belarus has become part of the story because Lukashenko essentially allowed Russian military to invade Ukraine from the territory of Belarus, to use its infrastructure, and until now he has provided a lot of support for Russian war effort. So definitely that Belarus is part of the story, even though it is not that visible kind of on the radars of experts, politicians, diplomats when they speak about the standoff between Russia and Ukraine. However, decisions that would derive from peace process, from the conversations between main stakeholders, they definitely would affect the situation in Belarus.
The war in Ukraine, Russian invasion into Ukraine. So Belarus is certainly, in a way, part of it, right? So while Ukraine isn't officially in a war with Belarus, because it's officially in war with Russia, Belarus has been sanctioned a lot because of its involvement in the war, as I understand.
Correct.
Is it right?
Yes.
The Trump was very vocal about, delivering peace in Ukraine. He seems to be still very determined, while, there are some maybe second thoughts about it. And of course, it's not like, it's not an easy task, right? So I think we're talking here about 100 days or something right now. So
Right.
It's not like a 24-hour ceasefire agreement, right? That could
But
be
not
reached.
6 months either.
Yeah, not 6 months either. I think I watched the press conference. And he definitely said it should be happening much earlier because, people are dying every day in the front. There are like thousands of people killed from Russian side, from Ukrainian side, from both sides. So it's their situation. And it's really, I really don't understand like what are the perspective of it, because it doesn't seem that either of the sides winning this war. It's basically a stalemate. But speaking of Belarus, so do you think that there is an interest in the U.S. government that Belarus is somehow present on the agenda of these supposed to be negotiations? And do you think there is a chance the Belarus question will be present there? And actually, who would talk on behalf of Belarus? Who would represent Belarusian interest if such agenda point would be on such negotiations?
Well, I certainly welcome the drive from President Trump to finish this war as soon as possible. And I think that his energy, his clean slate, his mandate that is very convincing from the American people, and the attention that the world is paying to what he says and what he does, this is definitely an asset when it comes to ending the war. However, of course, we understand at the moment that there is no clear format for negotiations. It might be a broader collection of actors at the peace table. At the same time, now we see that Trump and Putin want to meet personally, kind of to discuss. And this might become actually the format that would be coining out the main conditions of the peace deal. This brings a lot of concern in Ukraine, in Belarus, in the European Union, that certain aspects of the whole picture might be missing. Given that Putin is a rather experienced politician and diplomat, he might bring these negotiations to the format and conditions that he would find especially beneficial for Russia. That's why for us it is absolutely important that Belarusian voice is heard, that Belarusian interests are accounted for, not only because this is about Belarus, but also this is about Ukraine. If we want a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine that would be durable, that would be lasting, we definitely need to account for the situation in Belarus, because a Belarus that is under control of Russia, that happened after 2020, when Lukashenko lost his legitimacy, when he had to make a deal with Putin in order to get his support. And so that exact Belarus became the launching pad for the aggression. And if we want to exclude this possibility in the future, we want to make sure that Belarus is not under control of Russia and this situation does not repeat itself again. Otherwise, it would be impossible to speak about economic recovery of Ukraine. Who would want to invest billions of dollars in the recovery of infrastructure and of the entire economy of Ukraine if next day this could repeat again? So we want to make sure that Russian military is not in Belarus anymore, that nuclear weapons are withdrawn from Belarus, even though there is no clear confirmation of their presence, but also that certain domestic political problems are resolved, specifically release of political prisoners, stopping repressions, and finding ways for dialogue, political dialogue, to bring the country to free and fair elections that would restore the legitimacy of the ruling power.
What I'm a bit worried about, because sometimes we're being a bit of too abstract, as for me, when we talk about the conditions, because those conditions, someone needs to bring these conditions, right? So if you say about Russian military presence, like Russian troops withdrawal from Belarus, someone needs to give the order, right? If we talk about the release of political prisoners, someone needs to give an order to release them. So there is a certain way of abstraction when we talk about that. And remember, when we were in December in Brussels, you spoke in an event, and Artem Schreibman, the most, I think, competent, I believe, experts on Belarus, I hope we'll see him soon in this podcast as well. He asked you directly, like, if Lukashenko does have the effective control inside the country. So, as we often say, he has a key to jails, right, to release people. Would it be okay that Lukashenko would negotiate on Belarus' behalf in such a negotiation?
Well, definitely Lukashenko is exercising this effective control over Belarus, and he has made a lot of decisions on Belarus. And unfortunately, many of those decisions deteriorated situation in Belarus and strengthened control of Russia over Belarus, weaponizing Belarus against European neighbors, against Ukraine, instrumentalizing Belarus in this standoff of Russia, geopolitical standoff with the democratic world. So at the moment, he has been compromised, frankly speaking, when it comes to his following national interests of Belarus. And this makes, in my opinion, him a problematic representative of Belarusian people at the peace talk table. At the same time, we must ensure that there is some representation, that the Belarusian agenda is accounted for. And I think that it would be impossible to imagine that democratic forces represent Belarus at this peace table, simply because there are states talking to states and resolving state-level problems. So it would be hard to imagine such representation, but at the same time, it is possible to advance the interests of Belarus, national interests of Belarus, to our foreign partners, United States including, because the United States will definitely be part of the negotiation. So they are the best partner that we could have. And such work has been done already. Even a year ago, when there was a conversation about peace summit in Switzerland, that was the first attempt to determine, to articulate national interest as the result of such peace process. And these documents have been passed to our partners across the board, including in the United States. So this work continues until now. As situation unfolds, it is also necessary to update this interest and to ensure that when there is an actual conversation, that expert support from Belarusian democratic field is also present there, that they are able to consult and calibrate, so to say, approaches and specific ideas.
Probably, but let me tell you one story that I have heard recently. Last Thursday, if I'm not mistaken, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, he visited Kiev for signing off this 100 years agreement. So the UK government obliged themselves to support Ukraine in the amount of £3 billion per year as long as the war will continue. So on one hand, this is, a very clear sign of support and standing. At the same time, I was in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office on Friday last week, right after that meeting has happened. And we met some officials from the desk and from the department on Eastern Europe. And I asked them very straightforward about what do they think about the Belarusian interest on these negotiations? What do you think about the regional security configuration? And the answer was, Ukraine is a democratic country, so we cannot recommend anything to anyone. So we support Ukraine, and Ukraine will handle it by themselves because it's a democratic country. And in the first glance, this is a very rightful, very morally rightful stance to have. But at the same time, Putin doesn't want to negotiate with Ukraine, as you have said. He wants to negotiate with the West. He wants to speak to Trump. He probably wants to speak to someone from Europe. But, the leadership question is acute, I believe, in Europe. To me, it's a bit hypocrisy here. Because you say, look, we gave you money, and then you handle it by yourselves. So it looks like the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office really doesn't have any vision on what they want to achieve. So I just hope that, as you say, the U.S. government does have this vision, and they will take account the Belarusian interest. But there is always a risk, that no one actually will vouch for Belarus in such negotiations. Let's hope the Ukrainian side may be, because, as I believe, they clearly have some economic interest in restoring relationship with Belarus. Belarus has been a key trade partner for Ukraine before the war, so maybe Ukrainians will. But, we're here at a very big risk. We're the most sanctioned country. I think we are even more sanctioned than Russia because we have sanctions because of human rights crisis, and now we have the same sanctions because of the war. So Belarusians, they get a visa to the U.S. for 1 year, and Russians get for 3. So it's really a risk for us, to just be forgotten. So that's what I'm worried about.
Yeah, well, but this is on us. This depends on how active we are, how pushy we are, how convincing we are with our suggestions. And we definitely do not need to work only with the United States or with the new administration, but also with the UK, with the European Union, with Poland and Lithuania. Those countries who also have a very special voice because of the leadership of Western democracies in the region.
Another thing that I wanted to talk with you, maybe which relates more to an internal political jam Belarus, I devoted my first episode actually to this issue, to this event, tomorrow, as we record this podcast on the 25th of January. On the 26th of January, the Lukashenko will hold his 7th, something like that, presidential elections to very probably be re-elected as a standing president of the Republic of Belarus. Clearly, and I have highlighted many times, you cannot recognize the electoral process as free and fair while you have 1,300 political prisoners in jail. So only this factor means that, the elections won't be recognized by the international community. But what do you think this means for the Lukashenko, his perception on the West? Would it, legitimize him? Would it, help him to improve his agency? And what does it mean for the democratic opposition in exile?
Yeah, well, these are very, very big questions and very important to all Belarusians. But first of all, of course, this term, technical term, political term, and legal term of elections is not met on any counts when it comes to Belarus this time. But simultaneously, I would like to compare this presidential campaign with the presidential campaign of 2020. Back then, Lukashenko did not even campaign. He was not present, he was not talking to people. Essentially, he left the entire field to democratic candidates who have been very active and very convincing, very appealing to many. But this time around, yes, he's essentially the only one who's campaigning, but he's trying really, really hard. And I think that he has learned his lessons in this regard, that he wants to convince people that he deserves their vote and their trust, and that he's the only one actually who can bring Belarus further into the future. So in this regard, at least I can say that he's not sitting around and not counting only on the fraudulent count of votes. Yes, there will be falsifications in the process. We all know how it works in Belarus, but he's not taking this for granted, and he's not taking chances this time around. So when it comes to the outcome of the elections and what would be the response from the international community, I would like to separate here two concepts: the legitimacy of the power and the international recognition. The legitimacy comes from the votes of Belarusians who elect in free and fair elections new president or the next president. In this regard, Lukashenko cannot count that he will restore his legitimacy as a democratically elected president, because the electoral process just does not stand any criticism at all. However, international recognition would be difficult to achieve. Countries saying like, all right, election passed, and now we are back to normal, and we will sort of try to fix the problems we had in our relations. And this is on the surface. But at the same time, since 2020, even though Lukashenko has been unrecognized, in a very clear and very explicit way, he is illegitimate, we don't have anything to do with him, we're installing this political and diplomatic isolation for Lukashenko, his actions have never been challenged or disputed by the international community. For 4.5 years, since August 2020, Lukashenko has ruled the country. He has made a lot of decisions, some of them very fateful, when it comes to integration with Russia, deployment of nuclear weapons, or engaging in the war against Ukraine. This has not been challenged, and there hasn't been voices from the international community saying like, well, look, you don't have the mandate from the people, you don't have legitimacy, so decisions that you are making are void, and you don't have the right.
But I mean, even if you claim they're void, it doesn't mean you cannot make the decisions, right? I mean, you can claim anything as long as as long as you have the control on the territory, right?
That's right. That's right. But what I mean is that was this indirect recognition of his rule, that yes, he is ruling the country, yes, he is making decisions. And this is problematic, frankly, for me, because in some way it normalizes decisions made by Lukashenko. Some of them are undermining national interests of Belarus. So will this continue after tomorrow's vote? I think it will. So essentially, Lukashenko will stay where he is, and he will continue calling shots for the entire country.
Yeah, this is actually an important point. I think if even we take this classic Weberian legitimacy account. So there is a legitimacy which comes essentially from tradition. So while there is someone in power for a prolonged time, this actually creates a sort of acceptance, right, of this power, even if it's not democratic, because there is a lot of non-democratic countries in the world. Even some countries in NATO, I believe, have political prisoners which are recognized by the international community. still they're recognized as a power, and they have been perceived as a partner in some questions, especially in the security questions.
Well, look, Lukashenko hasn't had normal international recognition and internal legitimacy since 1996, when he adopted a new constitution that empowered him and kind of made him a ruler as he is now, with a lot of authority, with a lot of powers. So he's used to that. He's used to this deficit of legitimacy and very much embed international recognition of him as a legitimate president of Belarus. But nevertheless, he is where he is. And yes, a lot depends on him when it comes to the future of Belarus.
What about the opposition exile?
Well, I would say that the rule that legitimacy comes from people applies not only to Lukashenko, but also to his opponents. And everybody has to be clear-eyed about that. And I see sometimes that there is this confusion whether international recognition of political leaders could substitute legitimacy from Belarusian people. No, it can't, because the power is about the will of Belarusian people and the interests of Belarusian people. So it is necessary to be able to exercise your trust, your votes received from people, in order to resolve the agenda that is important to Belarusians. And we understand that the democratic movement at the moment is not in a position to meet all the demands from Belarusians.
Yeah, this looked like a very challenging times for everyone. Though I agree with you, Lukashenko still at pressure from the West, and I think we need to be very nuanced about that and leverage actually these instruments and this pressure to achieve what actually the society wants in Belarus. And it brings us logically to the question of political prisoners, because political prisoners, the release of political prisoners, was one of the three key demands from the society back in 2020. So when there were like 500,000 people in the streets, three demands were raised: the release of political prisoners, the accountability for those who tortured people and misbehaved, and the holding of new, free, and fair elections with the participation of the candidates which are popular or which are supported by the people. So political prisoners to release are the key demand. Do you think these elections or electoral process, so to say, or the ceasefire deal on Ukraine, does it bring any opportunities to release people from jails? What are the mechanics? What can be the mechanics?
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing this issue up. You know that for several months already, I have partnered with two outstanding women in Belarusian democratic movement. Tatiana Khomish, she's sister of Maria Kolesnikova. She's member of Viktor Babarika team, and she has been outspoken about the need to find ways to release political prisoners in Belarus, as well as Volga Gorbunova. She is my former colleague in the United Transitional Cabinet. Herself is a former political prisoner. So we have made it our mission to prioritize the release of political prisoners, to find ways, both internally but also internationally, how we can facilitate the process of releasing people. Importantly, since July last year, Lukashenko started releasing people in groups, in small groups, and on a fairly regular basis. By now, he has released 258 people from prisons, mostly people, as he kind of brought up this justification based on humanitarian considerations. People who are elderly, who have chronic diseases, who have many children, and so are facing difficult life situations, and so on and so forth.
But at the same time, they still arrest people, right?
That's right, but this is exactly the situation that you can look at it differently. You can say, yes, he's releasing people, but he continues repressions, or you can say, yes, repressions continue, but he's releasing people. And we have to look at this context from the brighter side. That's right. We need to work on stopping repressions in Belarus, slowing them down and seizing them altogether. But at the same time, this task now to facilitate the release of political prisoners is way more important, because there are people who've been in prison for years already. People are losing their health. People are losing their lives. There have already been 7 deaths at minimum recorded officially, people dying in prisons. And we see that there are still conditions to continue this process. So when it comes to international response, when it comes to specific actions from the international community, we understand that you can help this process or you can harm this process. So our call is to weigh the options, weigh the responses to what's happening in Belarus, and to ensure that new steps, new decisions that are made by our democratic partners, they help this process, they don't do harm.
When you say help the process, what do you mean specifically?
Well, kind of probably the very basic one, something that is absolutely accessible at any point of time, these are communications. How we speak about these processes. I think it is important to abstain from empty threats, from intimidating language, kind of to lower the temperature in communications between both sides. And I would say that both sides have kind of been engaged in this spiral of more and more kind of adversarial rhetoric.
Escalation spiral, right?
Escalation spiral, correct. And I think it is time to take stock and to think about this, and to think if when we use a more moderate language that would be objective anyway. And kind of we understand the situation in Belarus is very complicated, especially when it comes to human rights situation, but also the threat to our independence. But when we use this more moderate language, would it help us, or we should continue the same kind of throwing sometimes empty threats, like, for example, eliminating the regime? We know that this is impossible. We know that it will not be supported by Belarusians or by international partners. But at the same time, this is a good pretext for people in Minsk to consolidate, because it's a threat, but also it's a possibility to retaliate against people, not in Vilnius, not in Warsaw, but somewhere in Belarus, who are easily accessible. So we have to be considerate about that. Other practical steps could be using sanctions that have been accumulated so far as a reservoir, as a sort of exchange tool to agree on continued releases of people. I'm not talking here about sanctions that have been introduced because of the war, of supporting the war effort of Russia. I'm talking about sanctions that were introduced because of human rights violations, because of migration crisis, because of the hijacking of Ryanair. I think all these sanctions should be available to this negotiation process, like how we can use them in order to continue releasing people. And I would not speak now about complete lifting of sanctions, but about suspension of sanctions, because in the conditions when repressions continue, it is necessary to maintain certain leverage over the regime.
What you're actually saying that you perceive this political prisoners release recently from the regime as a sort of signal, and you urge that we match this signal, right? So the international community, the democratic forces, they match this signal in terms of they recognized the signal and give a hint, like to Lukashenko, that it has been noted. So this is how I hear you. But in the end, we come here to the question if we're really ready to negotiate with Lukashenko or his government officials on the release of political prisoners. Is this acceptable? Because I hear many voices, this should not be done. And the second part is more important part. Does Lukashenko really want to negotiate on political prisoners? Because a lot of criticism, I think, in that regard was coming from those people who genuinely believe he's not interested in talking to the West.
Yeah, first of all, about signaling. We cannot say that everybody understands what Minsk does. And the signals have been confusing and sometimes misleading. Many people are at loss, like what's happening. And I think this brings me to another suggestions that we're making, is that this is the time for active diplomacy. This is the time for more active engagement on a diplomatic level to figure out like what these signals actually mean. where it goes, where it leads to, kind of the entire country. And what could be the conditions to facilitate the process. So I think this is important to also to have clarity, and this is on us as well, and this is on democratic governments, because they have the means and they will be the negotiation partners for Lukashenko on this issue. Definitely, it might look like some kind of unwelcome development, kind of to engage with the regime on such a specific and very problematic issue for us. But this is exactly the case. That was our promise. That was our commitment to fight for the release of people until the first releases happened in July last year. Essentially, there were no releases whatsoever, and democratic forces could not do anything about this. But now we have this process. It's new, and it's important that people are leaving their prisons. It is also our duty and responsibility to fight for people who are losing their health, who are losing their life sometimes in prisons. But at the same time, I also see this as an entry point, as a possibility to establish some kind of positive interaction with Minsk about how we resolve the issue that is important to all of us, because these people are Belarusians, they belong to our society, and these people will also have to participate in building our country that would be prosperous, that would be sovereign, and that would be independent. So from this issue, we can also touch upon the problem of continued repressions, and we can see if we could establish conditions for internal dialogue, which eventually should lead us to resolution of the internal political crisis in Belarus.
I also truly believe in diplomacy, and I also think that you need to talk to anyone who can help you to solve the acute problem of political prisoners. It doesn't mean we recognize Lukashenko. It doesn't mean we accept that the elections are free and fair or he's a democratically elected leader. But as I have said, there is a lot of things happening in the world which are dependent on non-democratically elected actors. This is a reality we live in. So for me, this is not even a question. If we need to talk to someone from the government of Belarus to release people and to stop repressions, we need to do that. Thanks a lot for all this conversation. It was a very good one. Maybe you can, you have a chance to say something to our audience, to deliver a message, which is really important in these times.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to touch upon one specific development during this pre-election campaign. I read the program by Alexander Lukashenko, and there are 3 items that I found particularly interesting when he speaks about the need to preserve statehood of Belarus. He also speaks about the need to bridge divides inside the society, sort of to find common language and hinting probably at some kind of a dialogue. And the third one is that there is a need to normalize relations with the West, because this is where the Belarusian interests lie. And so I think these 3 items, they could actually be supported by anybody in Belarus. That yes, we want to live in independent, sovereign Belarus, and yes, we want to resolve this internal political crisis. And of course, we realize that our most important partners, with whom our future is closely connected, these are democratic countries of the European Union, because they're economically powerful. There's a great trading partners. Belarusians belong to the European family of nations, and they want to maintain the possibilities to travel, to educate themselves, to do business in Europe and with Europeans. So all these 3 items could be the start of the conversation. So what exactly this means? When elections are over, I mean, these are not elections, but nevertheless, when this campaign is over, this is a good starting point for us to have a conversation. Like, what exactly does Lukashenko mean when he speaks about 3 items? And what if this could become sort of the platform for us to resolve our differences and resolve the entire political crisis in Belarus, which is absolutely damaging to the future, to the present and to the future of our country, our society, our nation. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and again, congratulations on launching this very important podcast. This in itself is great news to Belarusians who crave to be present, who crave to be visible. Thank you for this, and I also would like to welcome listeners of this podcast because Belarus matters. Very often it has been below the radars of the international community, but this has had its consequences as well because Belarus, not accounted for as an important regional player, has been one of the factors that led to the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. Now, in this situation, we realize the importance, the role of Belarusian regional security, and I believe that free, democratic, independent, sovereign Belarus will be the factor that will contribute materially to restoring stability in the region and bringing prosperity to the entire Europe.
Thank you, Valery, for these words. I remember you mentioned the active diplomacy approach somewhere in the middle of our conversation. I think this is truly matches with the mood and the approach of the new administration appointed by the new elected President Trump. So yeah, let's hope that your message about the importance of independence and sovereignty of the country will reach the ears. We're a young country. It's been only 34 years. We have our own country as Belarusians in the modern world. So I think this is really the key to preserve the country. Then we have something to work with. Thank you, everyone. This was Valery Kavaleuski, the founder and the chair of Euro-Atlantic Affairs Agency, a think tank working on policy decisions and policy recommendations for international organizations and political actors. You will find the links to his social media pages in the bio and description of this podcast. Thank you, everyone, for listening this second episode of Belarus Factor, a podcast with focus on Belarusian political affairs and their impact on the regional situation in Eastern Europe.
You just heard Belarus Factor, a podcast about Belarus and me, Ivan Kravtsov. Please subscribe to our social media channels, share with your friends, and support Belarusian political prisoners.